All right, this is Devin Foley. I am replacing Kyle Hooten, though I don't think I could actually ever replace him. He does a magnificent job, but he got tasked to go and do bigger, better things for his country, so we are very excited for him. I am the CEO of Charlemagne Institute, and we are joining with Alpha News to be able to publish and host First Tuesday Conservatives meeting groups. Due to COVID, of course, they couldn't meet in person, so we turned to online, and this is one of the examples. Today, I have Allum Bokhari, who is the author of Deleted, Big Tech's Efforts to Sway the Election Revealed. And this is just a huge issue. We have a couple big things that just happened today when it comes to censorship. And I know from our side, running Facebook pages and Twitter, we've seen the abuses as well. So, but with that, Allum, I'd like to just open it up. Tell us a little bit about the book, why you wrote it, what you've seen, all of that.
So I've been covering the topic of tech censorship for almost 5 years now, since I started at Breitbart News as tech reporter. And when Breitbart started covering the tech issue, it wasn't really on anyone's radar. This was before Trump was elected. And we just started to see back then these tech companies and left-wing tech journalists turning against the ideal of internet freedom, the idea of an open and free internet, which had really animated Silicon Valley for the past 10 years or more. And this was the ideal that all the Silicon Valley giants initially adhered to. Twitter used to call itself the free speech wing of the free speech platform, of the free speech party, sorry. But they've completely turned that on its head. It's been staggering how quickly they've gone from promoting freedom, promoting a free internet, to the exact opposite over the past 4 years. And it really has been in response to the Trump election. This is why the subtitle of my book is Big Tech's Battle to Erase the Trump Movement and Steal the Election. So I've been talking to sources in Silicon Valley, inside Google, inside Facebook, inside Twitter for several years now. And they all say the same thing. They all say that right after the election, there was just complete panic in Silicon Valley, inside these far left tech companies with their far left cultures. And there was also a lot of guilt. The tech barons felt that they hadn't done enough to stop Donald Trump. And that guilt was fueled by the mainstream media and by Democrat advocacy organizations that accused platforms like Facebook of putting Trump in office. And what happened immediately afterwards was we saw, the rise of these initiatives against so-called misinformation and so-called fake news that did not exist in any way, shape, or form before the election. You just didn't hear about them. They were all set up in response to Donald Trump. And according to one of my Facebook sources, and I assume this is the same in other companies as well, it was driven by the most anti-Trump people inside the companies, and it was staffed by them as well. So the way my Facebook source put it was, the well was poisoned from the start. These were the people running the misinformation initiatives. So it's no surprise, today we're seeing Trump tweet after Trump tweet getting hidden or censored by Twitter for so-called COVID misinformation. The people in charge of the initiatives against misinformation in Silicon Valley were all rabidly anti-Trump, according to my sources. So I guess that's why I wrote the book, because we have these vastly powerful companies with power over political discourse, not just here in America, but around the world. And they have their political biases. There's nothing stopping them from acting on those biases, from acting on those motivations. And they've really grown to become a threat to democracy and a threat to free speech, the exact opposite of what they promised to be.
Absolutely. And we actually, on our end, we had been building an audience ferociously in 2015. The last couple of months of the year, we added over 200,000, actually over 220,000 new followers to the Intellectual Takeout Facebook page organically. And then what we saw in early January was that our numbers were falling off the cliff for no apparent reason. And of course, for those who don't know, it's a lagging indicator when it comes to that video, or to your ability to measure things. But to us, it was very apparent that January 1, 2016, the spigot was damn near turned off as far as the ability to communicate to our audiences. And so this threat is very, very real. What led you to get into this specific work? Stepping back even before the campaign, or 2016, all of that. But how did you get involved in the movement? How did you get involved pursuing this work specifically?
Well, I'm a millennial. I grew up with the internet. It was very much part of my early adult life. And I think I and other people of my generation saw this coming a bit before everyone else, because we saw on places like Reddit, places like 4chan, all these millennial websites that weren't really well known at the time to the outside world. These battles over free speech started to take place, and because on the one hand you had these anonymous message boards that really allowed people to violate taboos and challenge old political orthodoxies, but on the other hand you had this millennial culture that had been educated in these far left universities that were starting to become horrified by what they saw on the internet, by people just going online and challenging all their myths, challenging all their politically correct orthodoxies. So that was the source of what really became like the millennial culture wars, and free speech on the internet was a big battleground in that. So that was really happening before Donald Trump. It was happening in 2014. If any of your viewers followed the Gamergate controversy, that was internet free speech was a big part of that. So I saw all that coming, and as someone who enjoyed sort of the freewheeling Wild West atmosphere of the early internet, that's why I decided to get into it, because I just saw this massive backlash against online free speech building up, and we're now living with the results of that.
It really is. The speed of the change is incredible. Can you speak to the conflict that a lot of people are asking? Well, why can big tech do this? They're acting as a publisher, but claiming that they are more just a facilitator. Can you speak to that a little bit, and some of the legal challenges or issues that are in there for our viewers?
So the reason why social media platforms can exist as they are today is because they're protected by a special law that was given to them in the 1990s, and that law says they're not going to be liable for any speech they host created by other users. So Twitter can't be sued for the tweets of its users, Facebook can't be sued for the posts of its users, and so on. That's what allows them to host millions and billions of posts from other people around the world, which without suffocating under lawsuits. So it's quite essential for their business model as platforms. The problem is they're not really acting as platforms anymore. They're acting more like publishers. So they're picking and choosing what we see on the front page. And if you're acting like a publisher, the question is, why are you still immune from defamation lawsuits? If you're choosing what I see when I log into Twitter or what I see when I log into Facebook, why are you not liable for that? You chose to put it there. So that's the question. They're becoming less like newsstands or less like libraries just carrying books, and more like the people who are writing the books, the people who are deciding what we see when we open up the covers. And I think the problem in the law is that it doesn't really define the distinction between a platform and a publisher. So they're able to get it both ways now in court. They're able to say, well, we have the First Amendment rights for publisher. We can just censor whoever we want, choose whose messages go where, just editorialize as much as possible. But we're also online platforms, therefore you can't sue us for defamation, like First Amendment publishers would be liable for. So I think that the solution, in my mind, is simply to say that, look, if you want this special legal protection that no other industry enjoys, then you have to behave like a platform. And for me, it's very simple. You don't need a huge bureaucracy to enforce this, like some people say. You just need to say, if you're a platform, any filter you create on legal speech has to be optional to the user. The user has to have clearly opted in or opted out of that. This is not an onerous regulation for tech companies. Google for a long time has had a safe search button in the top right-hand corner of the screen. You can turn that safe search button on if you want to have family-friendly search results, if you want to filter obscenity. But they don't provide any sort of option like that for their filters on so-called hate speech or so-called fake news or so-called conspiracy theories. They easily could give people that option, but they won't, because they want to retain that power over political discourse. It's valuable to them. And they'd get brutalized by the media, by Democrats, by their own advertisers if they didn't use that power. So I think we'd actually, in a way, be doing them a favor for Congress to say, well, look, this is the industry standard now, you have to do it. You can't, it's not your choice anymore. It would sort of let them off the hook, because then they're, activists and journalists and all the other groups have been pressuring them to censor more and more. They wouldn't be able to do that anymore.
Yeah, I saw, I think it was the New York Times, either today or yesterday, had a nice article railing against Facebook for allowing too much hate speech and disinformation. So that pressure cooker that they are under is true. Uh, I guess the big question is, do you think, given that Democrats are largely the ones who are benefiting from this system, and it's their friends within the establishment and the tech companies largely, it's not always the case, but largely. So it's left to Republicans if they're to push back against this and actually change the laws. What do you see? Do they have the guts to do it? Do they have enough courage to be able to stand up? Or are we going to be finding ourselves more and more censored with no recourse?
Well, the courage issue is, I think, a big problem for many establishment Republicans. There are some Republicans who are very good on the issue. Josh Hawley's really made it into a national issue. Ted Cruz as well, Paul Gosar, Matt Gaetz. They've been doing great work on this stuff. But you hear very little from Mitch McConnell about this. You hear very little from the leadership. Just the other day, there was a Senate candidate in Delaware, the Republican Senate candidate, who was locked out of Twitter for criticizing mass migration, essentially using the same language that Donald Trump did back in 2016, and not a peep from the Republican leadership in the Senate about that, probably because he's an anti-establishment, America First type candidate. But it's almost like some Republicans would rather talk about censorship in Hong Kong or censorship of Uyghurs in China, which of course it's an important issue. But before trying to fix China in China, maybe make sure that the China's culture of censorship doesn't come to America via Silicon Valley. That appears to be what's happening at the moment.
Well, virtue signaling is easy to do, especially when there's very little you can do about the situation. It's really a measure of your character and your guts and your strength, what you do in your own country, even under fire.
I will say, just on your previous question, the Trump administration is making good progress on the tech censorship issue. So they did introduce a social media censorship executive order that's now working its way through the bureaucracy. And they made a very good appointment, I'm hearing, Nate Symington, to replace the old establishment Republican commissioner on the FCC. Unfortunately, the Senate Commerce Committee seems to be, which is controlled by Republicans, by the way, seems to be slow walking that nomination. It's quite critical tackling big tech censorship.
Yeah, I've seen that. It looks like President Trump is regularly tweeting about that when the tweets get through.
Yeah, so the Trump administration is certainly trying to work on the issue, but again, it's frustrating because Republicans in the Senate don't seem to be helping him out very much.
It seems as though, is this going to end up being a grassroots populist issue? As far as who is interested in preserving their speech, it's the little guy who has no recourse to law and doesn't have enough money to figure out other ways to be able to communicate their message or product or whatever it is. So would you see it that way? I mean, if you do have President Trump as a populist president, then it seems that they would be coming together. And do you see that being enough power, if you will, amongst the people to put that pressure on Congress to actually make the changes?
I think that's the only way it will happen, because I don't think Congress will do it on its own. You have to remember that, elite Republicans, they can always just go on Fox News. They'll have a platform that way that'll never get taken away from them. But for ordinary people, ordinary bloggers, people who run businesses online, people who depend on Facebook and YouTube and Instagram for their livelihood, as an increasing number of people do, this is critical. This is life or death. This is, if they're a political candidate, they need these platforms. If they're a business owner, they need these platforms. So it's just essential to ordinary people in a way that it isn't really for high-ranking Republicans. So I think the grassroots will always take it more seriously. And at the moment, what we're seeing is an alliance between the grassroots and Donald Trump to fix the problem. He is trying to use his executive powers to do that. But certainly, it probably must be from the grassroots. And the point about businesses, I think, is essential, because this is where it's not a partisan issue anymore, right? So the point I always make is, if you rent out space in a parking lot to run a hot dog stand, you have more rights vis-a-vis getting evicted from that parking lot than you do You have more legal rights, more due process available to you if someone tries to unfairly evict you than you do if you're running a Facebook page worth $1 million or a YouTube channel worth $1 million, or if you have hundreds of employees dependent on your social media businesses. You have virtually no rights in the latter case, even though your entire livelihood might be dependent on these platforms.
Absolutely. Again, we've seen it on our side. It is a flip of a switch and you find yourself in a whole new world where it's already alarming what's taking place right now. And the things that, for instance, that you've uncovered as far as reports from the inside of Silicon Valley. But how much further does this go? Is there an end game, or is it just going to continue to get worse and worse and worse?
Well, there's some really sinister stuff going on behind the scenes, and I think this is why I'd really recommend people read the book, because you can get it at deletedbook.com, but you'll hear it from people inside these companies themselves, what they've seen going on, and they're so alarmed by it that they put their own careers on the line to come forward and talk about it. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The first is network analysis. And the people who support online censorship, that's people inside and outside Silicon Valley, want to use network analysis. And in fact, it's already being used by some of the algorithms of these companies to censor not just one or two people or one or two publications, but entire movements at the same time. So there are two ways you can do that. You can use network analysis, or you can use language analysis. So language analysis is when you train algorithms to recognize certain types of speaking. So people who talk about the same issues, share links to the same websites. If you train an algorithm to suppress everyone who speaks in a similar way about similar issues, that would be one way to suppress an entire movement. But I think an even more, and that's already alarming. And we know that Twitter's been talking about doing that. They were caught in camera by Project Veritas talking about doing exactly that. But there's also network analysis. So network analysis is simply looking at who's connected to who on the internet. So say you've got a huge conservative influencer who gets banned and they have like 1 million followers. The 1 million followers might not necessarily get banned, but you could easily train an AI algorithm to say, well, look at all the people who are following this account that posted hate speech or posted conspiracy theories. Maybe we don't want to ban them, but maybe we want to deboost them, make their post go a little less viral. So that's another way that Silicon Valley can very easily censor not just one or two people, but turn down the volume on entire movements, and concurrently turn up the volume on everyone else, so that we know they're artificially boosting the mainstream media as well. And it's hard to overstate how enormous that power is. And they don't just have that power over American political discourse, they have that power in Brazil, South America, in Europe, anywhere where they're dominant. So I don't think there's ever been a period in history where so much power over political discourse has fallen into the hands of so few people, and they're completely unaccountable. There's no transparency. There's nothing stopping them from using that power.
Yeah, and again, we've seen it. For those who are jumping in a little bit later, we are here with Allum Bokhari, who is the author of Deleted, Big Tech's Efforts to Sway the Election Revealed, and he is discussing with us what exactly is happening right now, and when it comes to big tech censorship, how they're affecting things, and what the future is or could hold. And again, we've seen this as far as what other dangers are out there. I mean, if you've got the network analysis, we know the algorithms are there. We also know, that there is just the overt shutting down of somebody, either a tweet or an entire Twitter page. What else do we have to be worried about?
Well, you've got to consider the type of people who are in charge in Silicon Valley as well. These are all crazy lunatics. They're the kind of people you might find on a Berkeley College campus, right? So they all believe in critical race theory. They all believe in far-left feminism, all of these crazy, nonsensical, racist ideologies. They believe in it, and they've even created an entire field. It's called machine learning fairness, the purpose of which is to merge the fields of computer science and critical race theory, left-wing sociology, left-wing feminism, all of those fields, bring them together to make sure that the artificial algorithm, which is going to have so much influence over, whose political movements are successful, whose businesses are successful, whether you're on the first page of Google, whether you're on the 1000th page of Google where no one will find you, all of this is controlled by algorithms. They want to make sure those algorithms are being trained in a manner that's consistent with left-wing beliefs. So The wrong story about crime and race in America would not be ideally for these people, that would never be on the first page of Google. That's just one example. So yeah, it's definitely, I think it should be like a top issue for Americans, this, because it's, like I said, it's an unprecedented amount of power. It's the kind of power that, you know, the KGB could only dream of.
Oh, I couldn't back you up any more firmly, because again, we've just seen it. You're doing, you know, your day-to-day job, you're doing your social media, you're writing your articles, and then literally the next thing you know, nothing is working. And that is the power that they have. One of the challenges we've seen is where, you know, set aside those obvious censorship of a tweet or somebody's account being frozen. One of the things that we've seen, which is frustrating or not seen, is how do you prove it? You know, it's one thing to be able to say, okay, well, I've got an insider who's saying this is going on, but how does the little guy or the smaller institution or even Breitbart or something like that, how do you prove it? That seems to be one of the big challenges to making your case.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's no transparency. They don't have to explain how their algorithms work. They don't have to reveal their data sets. You know, like I'd love to see the kind of data that's used to train the hate speech algorithms, that's used to train these algorithms how to recognize hate speech, what examples they're using. I've got a pretty good idea of what examples they're using, but I'd like to actually see it. That's one of the easy things that Congress could impose upon them. And, you know, to be fair, John Thune, who's quite, you know, an establishment Republican, has a transparency bill that would do just that. I think that would be a step in the right direction. But yeah, you can't tell. In some cases, they will be just completely brazen about it. So we published a story at Breitbart News a couple of months ago showing that our visibility on Google search results has gone down 97.3% compared to 2016. 97, that's almost all the visibility gone.
Yeah,
and by the way, the traffic is fine. So it's not like Breitbart suddenly became unpopular and people aren't visiting. People are still visiting. They're going and typing in www.breitbart.com. They're still visiting the site. But Google is clearly using criteria other than popularity to determine what goes on its front page now. You know, it's probably all sorts of political criteria they're using right now. So something that's so brazen that you just see it. And by the way, that's happened to many other conservative sites too. The Daily Caller's experienced similar, the Daily Wire, the Gateway Pundit, Rebel News, they've all just cratered on Google, despite their traffic numbers staying pretty consistent.
Yeah, our Google numbers have just, I mean, they're destroyed right now, you know, and we're looking, and again, it goes back to that proving it. You know, you're asking yourself, well, is it our SEO? Is it our website? What do we do wrong? This and that. And again, you have no transparency to be able to go into the algorithm. Of course, even if I was looking at the algorithm, I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what's going on with it. So definitely.
On the other hand, I mean, they've been caught red-handed on a number of occasions, to be honest, with these leaks. And you know, I was talking to an unnamed Republican congressional staffer a week ago and said, well, we don't have enough data on the problem. We need to get more data. But actually, no. Google published a document called The Good Censor, where they talk about how they moved towards internet censorship over the past 5 years. They literally called it The Good Censor. So that's their own words, not mine. We also leaked a file, an internal file from YouTube called YouTube Controversial Query Blacklist. So they called it a blacklist for controversial search queries. And it's filled with political search terms like abortion, Federal Reserve, even search terms specifically related to the referendum on abortion in Ireland that happened a couple of years ago. So specific election interference in a referendum. We caught them red-handed doing that. It was actually a Project Veritas who got their hands on the Ireland-specific search terms, and we caught them on a few of the other search terms like Federal Reserve and abortion. But yeah, actual election interference, we caught them doing that, red-handed, and still no action from Congress. It just shows you how the media's panic over so-called Russian election interference was completely partisan from the start. They don't care about unaccountable actors interfering in a foreign country's politics because Silicon Valley has been caught doing that and there's no outcry.
So one of the ones that I'm worried about as well, and I've seen this popping up in a few places, you know, setting aside the censorship, the shadow banning, all of the ways to control the, you know, information, and ultimately with the goal that, you know, the middle doesn't get exposed to any conservative, libertarian, free market, well, you name it, ideas that are out there. But what about, can you speak to some of the concerns over finance? As far as one that is talked about regularly in our shop is a concern over processing credit cards, PayPal transactions, things of this nature. What are you seeing out there that involves cutting out the legs from underneath an organization or an individual?
Yes, there's a whole chapter in the book on this, on financial censorship. This is absolutely the next frontier for liberals. Once they've shut down conservatives on social media, they want to go after them in the banking system as well. And they've actually forced crowdfunding websites like GoFundMe and Patreon to cut off service to conservatives and even just, classical liberals in the past. I think of Sargon of Akkad, the YouTuber. He's not really a conservative. He considers himself a classical liberal. Kicked off Patreon. But also the banking sector. So Visa, MasterCard, these have been pressured to install so-called human rights councils to determine whether they should continue providing a service to the so-called far right. So this is absolutely a campaign that the left is waging. They even have entire NGOs and pressure groups set up to achieve precisely this goal, just this goal. So yeah, this is the new left. They want to use the power of corporations to do what the First Amendment would prevent the government from doing instead.
Yeah, I can tell you on our side, we had our directors and officers liability insurance canceled on us by actually Chubb Insurance. And the letter was very specific that it was because of our conservative views. And so next thing we knew, we're scrambling to find D&O insurance. And you figure, okay, that's a one-off, something's weird. No, Hartford Insurance just sent us a similar note saying, we're canceling your workers' comp insurance. Like, I mean, I was talking to our lawyer and he's just sitting there, worker comp insurance, surely you're talking different insurance. I said, no. I said, and it's the same thing. So, I mean, this is very real. And as Allum is saying, this is a big, big deal as far as what's taking place out there. So
that's fascinating. I hadn't heard about insurance companies canceling before.
Oh yeah.
What's their concern? Just because you're conservative? That's literally it.
All of a sudden they decide that they don't want to be insuring an entity in any way that is publishing conservative ideas. In fact, the one from Chubb Insurance goes point by point through a number of our principles and says, yeah, this is, they don't go so far as to say hate speech, but this is wrong. And I mean, some of the principles that they highlighted as far as not being in line with their mission or core values or whatever it is. I mean, it was things such as a strong middle America. I mean, nothing, this wasn't, we're saying build a wall around America and nobody gets in anymore. Nothing. I mean, it was just pretty normal, conservative, free market, patriotic stuff, just normal. And they cited those as the issue for canceling us. So
that's incredible. Wow, that's even worse than I've heard about them.
Yeah. That's why I'm worried about the finance side and other things. Getting into where do we go from here? If we have to wait for Congress to get around and pass that, especially with a divided Congress, what do we do now? I've seen the rise of Parler, Gab, ThinkSpot, and a variety of new social media platforms. Is that where we have to go? Do we have to build an alternative infrastructure to all of this?
It doesn't hurt to have a presence on those platforms. I support supporting them. But having a presence doesn't solve the industry-wide problem, which is the lack of basic protections for consumers and businesses. That has to change. And despite a divided Congress, it simply has to be a grassroots movement that gets organized off social media, in real life, building those local networks, pressuring every single representative to act on the issue, Democrat or Republican. So I think you've got to do both things. You've got to support the alternative platforms, and you've got to pressure lawmakers for common sense reforms here. By the way, it's happened to Gab as well. The issue you mentioned with the payment processors,
right.
Visa, I believe, cut them off. So this whole argument that you can just build your own. Even Gab rubbishes this as a very simple comment that free market Republicans say. It's not that easy, because you saw what happened to Gap. Not only their payment processor cut them off, but their DNS registrar cut them off. A DNS registrar is, the people who give you your web address. You don't have a web address without DNS registrar. Their hosting provider as well. They're the people who provide the space on the internet for your website. They had to switch multiple times. And they were also banned from both the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store. And when you consider the fact that Google and Apple between them control 99% of all smartphone operating systems around the world, that's every smartphone that they were excluded from. So it's not that easy to build a competitor if you're going against Silicon Valley's values.
Well, it also seems too that, if conservatives just go off and build their own networks, you're doing sort of a high-tech version of the old newsletters and magazines that were taking place in the 80s, where you end up with the danger of an echo chamber, and your ability to reach people in the middle with ideas is greatly diminished. Either way, if they continue the censorship or conservatives switch over and try and build up a separate infrastructure, I can definitely see the need for a strong grassroots response to this. Let's say if President Trump wins re-election, do you see this becoming a driving issue of him now that he has, seen a lot of the full fury of these tech companies? Is that one of the hopes that we might have for real action taking place?
Absolutely. I do think internet freedom is on the ballot this November. I think if Donald Trump is re-elected, he's going to move forward on tackling this issue. He's already started the process with this executive order on social media censorship, which is very positive. He's also made some great appointments in the administration. The guy who drafted the petition to the FCC as part of the executive order, which is specifically to reform that law you're talking about earlier, Section 230, is a guy called Adam Kandeyev. And if you look into his background, he's actually fought free speech cases against Twitter. I've met him on a number of occasions. He understands the issue very well. He understands the problems with the power of these big tech companies. Nate Symington, the new FCC nominee, another great appointment. So I think you'll see real progress being made under a second term of Trump. But I do worry about whether that second term will happen, because I don't think any president in American history, like I said, the subtitle of the book, Big Tech's Battle to Erase the Trump Movement and Steal the Election. Never before have we seen the power of these tech giants, their vast power over the flow of information, deployed to such an extent to stop a president's re-election. We're going to see the effects of that on November 3rd.
Yeah, it seems like we have entered into an era of will to power, and you're seeing it even in the polling now, where people who, a significant chunk of Americans, both left and right, are saying that yes, violence is okay to achieve your political ends at times. And so I do wonder, when you look at the millennials and the younger generation, Zoomers coming up, what do you see as their overall response to this? Do you see it as something where they say, oh yeah, if it's hate speech, it should be removed, of course? Or do you see a desire to stand on the principle of free speech and open discourse?
Well, I think it's one of the big dividing lines of our time now. You've got half of America that does believe that the so-called Nazis and fascists and purveyors of hate speech, by which they mean almost every Republican, should be purged and exiled from society, not just from the social media platform, but from society at large. I think it was Keith Olbermann who said it the other day. I went on a whole rant saying we should just ostracize every Trump supporter, run them out of society. This is how a disturbingly large number of Americans think now, and it's a big problem. And I think it's going to be up to lawmakers, to Congress, to start imposing some level of political tolerance on society, because liberal societies, liberal democracies are based on the assumption of political tolerance, that you're going to have people with different viewpoints. They're going to disagree, but that's okay. You're not going to try and suppress people just for disagreeing with you. That's why liberalism was brought about, to address that, by which I mean classical liberalism.
Right.
So unless the nation's leaders, treat this as the problem that it is, Donald Trump is the only national leader who started talking about cancel culture. Now everyone's talking about it. that's just going to escalate.
Yeah, it seems very, very concerning that we almost have to make the arguments as far as why free speech and all of these things matter. At the same time, liberalism, classical liberalism, and the American system of government is based on the idea that we all agree to the rules. We get to say what we say, we do this, we do that, but when the election is done, we all sit back and we abide by the results of it, or abide by the rulings of the Supreme Court. But you just don't see that desire for fair play anymore. It is now will to power, and they certainly seem to have the will to crush and expunge all of their political enemies or anybody that they feel is a threat. When you're looking at some of your conversations as far as these tech leaders, I mean, Jack Dorsey, of course, CEO of Twitter, is notorious for firing off very hard left statements and things of this nature. And you had said earlier, just as far as the staff and the people behind these changes, can you just give us a little bit more of a perspective of how they view the world, and is there anything that even in themselves holds them back?
Well, I will say Jack Dorsey is not really the worst. Mark Zuckerberg's not the worst either. The pressure tends to come from the people immediately below them. So people like Vijaya Gad at Twitter, or Del Harvey, the head of trust and safety, much, much worse than Jack Dorsey. And pushing for censorship a lot harder, according to my sources inside the tech company. In fact, Dorsey sometimes has to push back on what these people want to do.
Wait. Jack Dorsey pushes back against his staff.
This is what I've heard from people inside the company. He's a bit more reasonable than the people below him, which it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe, I know, but apparently that's the case.
It's horrifying.
Zuckerberg, the same thing. There were some leaks, I think, in the New York Times a while ago. Him having to go up and explain to people why he's allowing some conservative media to be successful on Facebook, because his employees were just so outraged that sites like Breitbart continue to do well on the platform.
Right.
So in a sense, the CEOs are actually trying to hold back the tide a little bit, but they constantly give more ground. They constantly cave in and cave in and cave in. That's why we see the escalating censorship. And they no matter how much they're pushing back now, they've already gone far enough in terms of establishing these heavily biased anti-misinformation departments that are just completely weaponized against the right. The same with hate speech. And they're already in the process of training their algorithms to detect, to recognize conservative networks as networks of hate speech, or networks of conspiracy theories, or networks of misinformation. So that's already underway. So they haven't stopped it at all, even if they're making some token efforts now. But I will say Google are probably the worst. So only at Google have I heard that not only is this a bottom-up problem with radicals at the bottom of the company, but also radicals at the top. And we saw leaked footage that we published at Breitbart of their executives in the wake of the Trump election saying things like they want to make the Trump movement a blip in history. Their co-founder, Sergey Brin, co-founder of the company, comparing Trump voters to extremists, saying the election offended him. So in Google, the problem is very much at the top as well.
It's disheartening. I mean, at the same time, I think it's important for all of us to be able to see clearly what is actually taking place, and to grapple with it. And to your point, we do need to rally on this issue. It's fundamental to our country and to the West and our societies as almost anything else. It is the First Amendment, and that's important. Government, of course, we know, but this is a different way of doing it, and a very powerful one. As we wrap up here, Allum, is there anything specific you would leave with our viewers, or anything that you would urge them to do?
Well, there are so many things to do, but I think you got to start somewhere. And I think the place ordinary Republicans need to start with is look to your own representatives, to your own lawmakers. Are they speaking out about this issue? Do they speak Do they speak out more about censorship in Hong Kong than censorship of, Republican Senate candidates? Did your Republican representative talk about the censorship of, people they may not agree with entirely, people like Alex Jones, but did they at least say something that you shouldn't censor someone for having a different point of view? You've got to start there. You've got to have every Republican speak out every time someone is censored online, whether they agree with them or not. So if they can't do that, how are they going to solve the bigger issues? So start there, start demanding that your representatives show more courage in standing up for the people who the left is trying to cancel or censor or whatever else. Start there and go on from there. That's what I'd recommend.
I love it. So everybody watching, get on the phone, write a letter. Don't just do, your bulk email type things, but be purposeful. Reach out to your representatives and put the fire under their feet to be able to make this happen. So,
if you want to learn more about the issue, you can get the book at deletedbook.com.
Deleted book, go buy it. It'll be a good one. You'll probably be horrified and not sleep well, but it needs to be known and understood what's taking place. Allum, thank you so much. Again, Allum Bokhari, who is the author of Deleted, Big Tech's Efforts to Sway the Election Revealed, was generous and gave a good chunk of his time. Allum, that was enlightening, disturbing, and at the same time, I think very good in that giving people a direction to take this energy and this drive and to be able to put it into good work necessary to preserve our freedoms. So Allum, thank you so much for that, truly.
Thanks, Devin. It was a great discussion.
Absolutely. And to everybody watching, we've got a whole lineup this week, so watch your emails for updates. Again, this is First Tuesday Conservatives, and it is hosted, if you would, by Alpha News and the Charlemagne Institute. And I'm Devin Foley, CEO of Charlemagne Institute, filling in for Kyle Hooten, who got tapped by the White House and is off to new adventures. So thank you all for joining us. I look forward to seeing you again.